So one of the first things to understand if you want to optimize your hormones is where they come from. There are a lot of different glands in the body that produce hormones. There's the pineal gland. Some hormones are made in the hypothalamus. Hormones are made by the gonads, the ovaries, or the testes. You've got the thyroid gland. There are a bunch of different glands that make these different hormones. But when we're talking about the sex steroid hormones, estrogen and testosterone, the major sources are ovaries for estrogen and the testes for testosterone, although the adrenals can also make testosterone. So the adrenals ride atop the kidneys, and the release of these steroid hormones from the adrenals, in particular testosterone and some of its related derivatives, are mainly activated by competition. So let's talk about competition, because it turns out that competition is a powerful influence on the sex steroid hormones, and the sex steroid hormones powerfully influence competition. Now, it's well known in humans that both males and females who have elevated levels of testosterone will engage in more novelty seeking. And I do want to point out that even individuals without testes have testosterone, and peaks in testosterone have similar effects regardless of whether or not someone has ovaries or testes. Testosterone increases generally lead to more foraging, more novelty seeking, increases in libido, and increases in desire to mate. So it is the case that increases in testosterone promote competitive and foraging type behaviors. But it's also true that competition itself can increase androgens such as testosterone. Now, some people have come to the conclusion that if you win, your testosterone goes up, and if you lose, your testosterone goes down. And to some extent that's true, but that's not a direct effect on the gonads. That's actually mediated by the neuromodulator dopamine. And dopamine and testosterone have a remarkable interplay in the body. Dopamine is actually released in the brain in ways that has the pituitary, this gland that sits over the roof of your mouth, release certain hormones that then go on to promote the release of more testosterone. And indeed, winning promotes more dopamine and later more testosterone. However, in the short term, just competing increases testosterone independent of whether or not you win or lose. So the short version of this is that competition increases testosterone. So I just want to emphasize once more that increases in testosterone in females are also going to lead to increase in reproductive behavior or seeking out reproductive behavior. They increase libido. In fact, there's a particular phase of the menstrual cycle where testosterone peaks just before ovulation that on average leads female humans to seek out sex more than they would otherwise during their cycle. And this is all by self-report, but this is also while measuring things like testosterone, estrogen ratios, and so forth. So it's really interesting that a single molecule, regardless of chromosomal or gonadal background, is increasing seeking of mates across individuals, increasing desire to compete or willingness to compete, and lowering the threshold for stress and anxiety. It's important to point out that while increases in testosterone promote seeking of mates and reproduction in both males and females, in females, it's actually increases in estrogen that promote receptivity to mating. So testosterone is driving the seeking of sex, and estrogen is promoting the actual act of sex from females, so-called receptivity, consensual receptivity. In males, it's interesting to point out that testosterone is promoting seeking of sex, but it's also estrogen in males that's important for libido. If estrogen levels are brought too low, then men will completely lose their libido. This is often not discussed or overlooked in the discussion about testosterone therapy and performance-enhancing drugs. People think that hyperandrogenized individuals, meaning people that have very high levels of androgen, will have very high levels of libido. And they will, provided estrogen is available in sufficient ratios to match that testosterone. So it's not simply the case that high levels of testosterone produce a lot of sex and mating behavior and low levels of estrogen are good across the board. You actually need both in both males and females. It's just that in females, the testosterone levels are always going to be lower than the estrogen levels. And in males, the estrogen levels are always going to be lower than testosterone levels. So testosterone promotes sex-seeking behavior. And the real question then is, does sex itself promote testosterone? And the answer is somewhat complicated, but the short version is yes. Sex has multiple stages. So there's the physical act of sex, there's the seeking of sex, and then there's orgasm and ejaculation. Now, it's important to distinguish between these because whether or not sex itself increases testosterone depends on whether or not the male ejaculates. But then after ejaculation, there's a release of prolactin, and prolactin actually sets the refractory period in males during which he can't have sex again. And the duration of the refractory period will vary tremendously depending on how much and how long that prolactin release occurs. So there are studies showing that sexual behavior itself can increase testosterone. Men who observe sex, so I guess this would be observing pornography, will have slight increases in testosterone during the observation. These people actually were willing to have blood draws taken while watching pornography. They had increases in testosterone that were very modest, of about 10%. Whereas when people participated in sex, they actually did this study where people had blood draws and they had real sex with their partners, and they had 70% increases in testosterone. So there are increases in testosterone that are quite significant during the physical act of sex, and far less so during observing sex. Now, the question that I often get, in fact, is one of the questions I get most often in the comments on YouTube, I don't know why that is whether or not ejaculation adjusts testosterone levels. And it turns out there are two studies that I could find that were quality studies on PubMed that address this, that sex and ejaculation itself does not reduce testosterone levels, although it will increase prolactin levels. However, abstinence or sex without ejaculation for a week or more will increase testosterone levels up to 400%. So the answer is actually complicated. It's not straightforward. What it means is that sex itself increases testosterone. However, abstinence also increases testosterone even further. So it's a nuanced answer, and you have to understand that nuance if you want to understand how certain behaviors impact hormones and how hormones impact those behaviors. As I mentioned before, in females, testosterone also primes the motivation to seek out sex. And sex itself also increases testosterone, but it also increases prolactin. So in both men and women, sex increases prolactin post-sex. It's just the way that the system works. It's that testosterone and dopamine increase in the seeking out and the behavior of sex, and then after sex, prolactin levels go up. There's kind of a quiescence. The whole nervous system is promoted towards calm, and this may actually have something to do with pair bonding and the encouragement of individuals to spend more time together to exchange different smells and hormones. Cortisol is a stress hormone that is released early in the day as we wake up and serves healthy roles in protecting us against infection, reducing inflammation, etc. But you don't want cortisol to be too high, and you certainly don't want it elevated too long throughout the day and night. How sleep actually adjusts things like testosterone and estrogen, and it does it by modifying cortisol. So the molecule cholesterol can be converted into testosterone or estrogen, but there's a competition whereby the cholesterol will turn into cortisol and not testosterone, or it'll turn into cortisol and not estrogen if stress levels are too high. So the simple version of this is getting your breathing right during the waking hours, meaning primarily, unless you're working out really hard or there's some other reason why you're maybe eating or speaking that you need to be breathing through your mouth, you should be a nose breather. There's really good evidence for that now. And in sleep, you also want to be a nose breather because that's going to increase the amount of oxygen that you're bringing into your system and the amount of carbon dioxide that you're offloading. There are other positive effects of it as well, but you're basically reducing apnea. Breath holding in sleep leads to buildup of carbon dioxide and leads to increases in cortisol, which then decrease testosterone and decrease estrogen in negative ways across all sexes. Okay, so the simple version of this is get your breathing right. So how do you do that? How do you get your breathing right? Well, for some people that have severe sleep apnea, they're going to need the CPAP machine. This is a machine that you actually put on your face and it helps you breathe properly in sleep. Many people, however, are starting to do this thing of taping their mouth shut. Now, this sounds a little bit extreme, and you certainly don't want to do this in any way that's dangerous. James Nestor talked about this in his book, Breath, The New Science of a Lost Art, that simply taping shut the mouth with some tape that will allow you to open your mouth if you really need to during sleep can allow people to shift over from being mouth breathers and snorers to nose breathers. In the daytime, the best way to get good at nasal breathing is to dilate the nasal passages, because a lot of people have a hard time breathing through their nose. And one way to do this is to just breathe through your nose more. And one way to do that is that when you exercise, in particular cardiovascular exercise, most of the time, provided you're not in maximum effort, you should be nasal breathing. My advice would be breathe through your nose while exercising unless you're in maximum effort. Pretty soon what you'll find is you actually can create more output than you would if you were breathing through your mouth. Learn to be a nasal breather. It has positive cosmetic effects. It reduces apnea. It offloads more carbon dioxide. It increases lung capacity. It dilates the sinuses, and it prevents apnea in sleep. So unless you have severe apnea and you need the CPAP, becoming a nasal breather can have all sorts of positive effects by reducing cortisol, reducing apnea, and indirectly raising testosterone and estrogen in the proper ratios. So that's the first piece of behavioral advice. The second piece of behavioral advice relates to the viewing of light. And many of you have heard me talk about this before, and I'm not going to belabor the point that viewing bright light within the first hour of waking, whether or not it's from artificial light or ideally from sunlight, has these powerful effects on sleep and wakefulness. But we have to return to this if you want to understand how light can impact hormones, because hormones, light and dopamine have a very close-knit relationship, so much so that your light viewing behavior can actually have a direct effect on hormone levels and fertility. It can have a direct effect on hormone levels and libido. It can have a direct effect on hormone levels and your ability to heal quickly. So nowadays there's a lot of interest in using cold as a way to stimulate testosterone. This is mainly because in the sports community, in particular in the bodybuilding community, they are always seeking ways to maximize testosterone, dihydrotestosterone, keep estrogen to its minimum required to still have libido and still have, skin elasticity, but also walk around with saran wrap skin. Then all this kind of extreme stuff that happens there has led to a recent movement where, believe it or not, I heard this and I couldn't believe it. I went and checked, although I didn't buy them, that on Amazon, you can actually find people have their literally underwear that have ice packs, or I think they're ice pack underwear, so that people are making themselves cold at the level of the gonads in order to try and increase testosterone and libido. Sounds pretty crazy. But believe it or not, that and things like ice baths and cold showers can have positive effects on the sex steroid hormones, both testosterone, mainly in males, and estrogen, mainly in females. And you might say, wait, I thought cold makes the reproductive axis kind of shut down a bit or reduces testosterone and estrogen. But it turns out it's not actually the cold that's having these effects in people. Things like the ice bath, cold showers, cold water swims, these ice underwear, or whatever they are. Can't believe that these actually exist, but they do exist. What happens is there's a rebound in vasodilation after cooling. So cooling causes vasoconstriction, and then after the cooling, there's a rebound vasodilation, and there's more infusion of blood into the gonads. There's also an effect that's neural. So let me explain how this works, because there are only a few studies on this, none of which looking at the frozen underwear, but that have looked at cold exposure and levels of androgens and estrogens. That's kind of interesting. So you have to remember that the gonad, the ovaries and the testes are heavily vascularized. Remember, even at the level of the brain, GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone, comes from neurons that, believe it or not, start off in your nose early in development, migrate into the hypothalamus. I'm not making that up. They started off in your nose and migrate into the hypothalamus. Those neurons extend processes, we call them axons, into the pituitary and release GnRH into the pituitary. There's a lot of vascularization within the pituitary, so now those hormones, or GnRH, can stimulate follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, which then are released and travel into the bloodstream. Then those hormones reach the ovary or testes, and they have to get into the ovary and testes. And the way they do that is through the vascular system. And people forget, but the vascular system and how constricted or dilated vessels are is controlled by neurons. It's well known to neuroscientists that the best way to shut down neurons is to cool them. So there are a lot of examples of this in the scientific literature, but most people aren't aware of it because you're not digging around in the methods section of these papers. But when we want to shut down neurons, we can do things like inject drugs that will do that, like lidocaine, the stuff that makes you numb at the dentist, or you can use different inhibitors. But one of the best ways to do it experimentally is to just cool neurons. When you make neurons cold, because there's a temperature dependence of when neurons can be active and when they can't, the neurons shut down. So the most plausible explanation for why cold exposure, either through 1 to 10 minute ice bath or cold shower or the ice underpants thing, would increase testosterone or increase estrogen, is that you're cooling the neurons that control vasoconstriction and vasodilation and shutting down the entry of blood, or at least reducing it, and hormones into the gonad. And then when the gonad and the surrounding area heats up again, you're getting a rebound hypervasodilation that delivers excessive levels of, not excessive, but increased levels of GnRH and other hormones and carriers and carrier proteins and so forth that would then stimulate the gonad to release more testosterone, or would stimulate the gonad to release more estrogen. That's the most plausible explanation I can come up with. Put simply, we don't know whether or not cold and heat directly affect the production of testosterone and estrogen. We only know that cold and heat can modulate those, probably through indirect mechanisms like controlling the amount of blood flow by way of shutting down or activating the neurons. Now, there's a lot of lore around heating up the gonads too much. There's actually a whole set of pseudoscience web pages out there saying, well, if you want a girl, you should, conceive the child at this room temperature. And if you want a boy, you should conceive the child at this room temperature. I don't think there's really any firm scientific evidence for that, for either one. But there's some interesting literature about temperature dependence of production of hormones. And I think that it probably relates to these mechanisms of vasodilation and neural control over vasodilation.